Welcome students to lecture 17 of MHHS 1. We left the English department for the Media and Cultural Studies department, MCS, last time. And this time we're moving on to yet another fabulous UCR department that you may be interested in checking out. For the next two lectures, we'll be reading Chikako Takeshita's essay, The IUD in Me, on Embodying Feminist Technoscience Studies. Takeshita is in UCR's Gender and Sexuality Studies department, but has formal training primarily in a field called Science and Technology Studies, STS. STS is a well-established field around the country since at least the late 20th century, but UCR doesn't have an STS department yet. And actually, just in a little institutional history, we're currently trying to figure out if there's a need for one. And if you think this is something that you'd like to see, make sure the administration just hears about it from students. This essay combines those two areas of Takeshita's expertise, STS, Science and Technology Studies, and feminist scholarship. What this approach should immediately recall is Annika Speer's essay on embodied performance, in which the personal relationship with the issues or objects of analysis enriches the research rather than irretrievably biasing or compromising it. Instead of embodied performance, that phrase from Annika Speer, Takeshita's disciplinary formation instead calls it, quote, reflexive embodied scholarship. So in this essay, Takeshita simultaneously takes the IUD, intrauterine device, as a research object and as a lived experience. She invites us to consider this form of reproductive technology not just from a neutral, observational positionality, but from a deeply personal and often confusing and contradictory perspective. Pay attention especially to how Takeshita weaves personal experience and critical analysis throughout the essay. Near the end of the essay, she uses the phrase STS lens as an instructive disciplinary formation. I want to begin by defining some of these methodological terms that might be unfamiliar to you. Also, it'll be interesting to see how this essay fits within Takeshita's larger book project, The Global Biopolitics of the IUD, How Science Constructs Contraceptive Users and Women's Bodies, published just a year after this essay in 2011. After we've situated this essay within its STS methodology and its larger research trajectory into the book, then I'll get to our usual reading strategy of unpacking the introductory and concluding sections of the essay. So let's right now just investigate what this STS lens is by taking a closer look at the paragraph in which Takeshita deploys this phrase. Quote, unequal access to contraceptive choice and inconsistent safety standards do not accidentally happen, nor are they solely determined by economic factors. At least in part, they are rooted in how users are configured in contraceptive research. Yet, the scientific discourse tends to conceal differences when it makes claims to a universal technology under the assumption that all women are biologically similar. Employing an STS lens helped me see that researchers played up or down women's divergent needs and positionalities in their efforts to formulate a device that meets the demands of various socio-historical contexts, end quote. So if you're looking for that paragraph that I just cited there, it's at the bottom of page 55. In 2023, we're relatively certain now that health inequities don't happen by accident. We're now quite used to hearing about disproportionate impacts of pandemics, bad air quality, fatal outcomes for expectant mothers due to income inequality. It's now a sad but common refrain to hear that bad health outcomes affect lower income communities. That's just commonplace now. What Takeshita's STS training helps her see, however, is that it isn't just economic factors that determine access to contraceptive choice and to reproductive safety. Instead, there's an additional social construction that's at work here. And the article sort of explores that. It's something fundamental about how consumers of reproductive technologies are, quote, configured or imagined by the scientific and medical producers of these new technologies. So I hope by now we're already prepared to roll our eyes when scientific or medical discourse purports to be something close to objective, or as we heard in Takeshita's passage there, as Takeshita says, universal. There is always a social construction at work when someone is trying to imagine a healthy body or a healthy, flourishing way of life. And that's exactly what Takeshita's STS lens reveals. Scientific discourse around reproductive technologies had operated on the purported objective and universal idea that all women wanted the same kind of control of their bodies. Instead, the STS lens allows Takeshita to see the varying positionalities of researchers of reproductive technologies, to uncover the inequities, divergences, and contradictions that scientific and medical discourse tends to suppress. So, going into this essay, I would say that the STS lens has at least two main things to teach us as MHHS students. First, scientific results and technological innovations are not neutral, objective, or universal things. And second, scientific and technological research aren't either. So there are real people behind that research with all the flaws that flesh is heir to. So let me just give you an example. So we like to think of these things as neutral, objective, or universal sometimes because of the great explanatory power of something like Newton's law of universal gravitation. And if you're not familiar with that, that just is the force of gravitation is proportional to the mass of the objects and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. So yes, that universal law of gravitation explained the movements of celestial objects. But what about the institutional controversies about the late 17th century, about how this result was obtained? How were the experiments done to confirm this result? What can we learn from Newton's dalliances with alchemy? So we could ask many questions from an STS lens, but still you might be asking, to what end are we asking all these questions? Why are we asking all these questions? Well, if there were no questions left to ask about this supposedly, this truth supposedly given from on high, then we would have never gotten to Einstein's theory of general relativity that revealed Newton's law of gravitation to just be only a really good approximation. STS encourages us to keep asking these questions. And that STS lens will help us understand Takeshita's essay right from the beginning. The IUD was a revolutionary innovation in reproductive technology. It was so revolutionary that it had a similar effect as something like Newton's law of universal gravitation. We didn't need to question it, we thought, because it was just that great. But Takeshita's research methodology had to keep asking questions. In fact, there were so many unanswered questions that Takeshita continued this project, this essay, into a book project called, as I mentioned before, The Global Biopolitics of the IUD: How Science Constructs Contraceptive Users and Women's Bodies. You'll notice that this essay puzzles through a lot of the felt contradictions about the IUD as a piece of reproductive technology and as a product that she herself mostly happily consumed and benefited from. As a disability studies person myself, what this reminds me of is the controversial technology of the cochlear implant. Some people in the big D deaf community view it as a kind of genocidal technology that views deaf culture, again, big D deaf culture, as something that doesn't deserve to exist. And yet, Disability memoirs, like the one I cover in my English 141 course called Mean Little Deaf Queer, works through their complicated relationships to these technologies through the narration of their lived experiences with those devices. I think Takeshita is doing something similar here, but instead of creative nonfiction, as is the case with Terry Galloway's memoir, she's chosen the genre of STS academic research. But what you'll notice is that the essay begins as if it were a piece of autobiographical creative nonfiction. Like Gloria Kim's essay that begins with a richly narrated story of the American Airlines passenger who is confronted with the mandatory viewing of that 7-minute corporate documentary from IBM, Takeshita's essay begins with a richly narrated scene at her Planned Parenthood appointment in 2002. The description is replete with brand names, SKU numbers, dosages, costs, and measurements, but all of this is blended with the complex descriptions of her own wavering feelings, her contradictory feelings about the whole procedure of getting the IUD. And this blend will be the consistent methodology throughout the essay in which she uncovers, quote, how social and historical conditions constructed her reproductive choice as an American consumer of the device, and how such, quote, choice is constrained by the scientific community's willingness to develop birth control methods, medical practices, and corporate profitability. So just as deaf people often question if they are being a bad member of the deaf community if they decide to get a cochlear implant, and that's something that we hear in Terry Galloway's memoir, Takeshita wants to explore through her academic research how to articulate her own really mixed feminist response to her choice to get the IUD. She calls this, quote, reflexive embodied scholarship. Her positionality as an IUD user enhances rather than corrupts her own research into how IUD developers shaped their technological innovations to the global political economy of women's bodies. She is arguing in this introduction that her research stance from the perspective of an IUD user actually makes her the perfect person to talk about the social and political history of the creation of the device. The first red flag about why we should be skeptical about the history of the IUD is how it was first developed, that history of how it was first developed. We learned that the IUD was originally developed for what sounds like eugenic population control in the global south. Birth control pills had to be taken regularly and weren't as reliable to do the work of population control as a kind of set it and forget it technology. So the next red flag that we hear is about the side effects. Quote, heavy bleeding, painful cramping, and longer menstrual period. And the red flags just keep coming up for Takeshita. She had benefited personally and professionally from her relatively good experience with the IUD, but there were many other women from the 1960s to the present, especially in the global south, that weren't so lucky. So she had to become what she calls an embodied knower, someone who is intimately and personally aware of the technology and its implications. And what follows is her attempt to describe as a consumer and as a researcher the diverse populations of women that the IUD has impacted. We're skipping to the last section called Feminism and the IUD Body on page 53 to get our usual overview of the argument in this first lecture. You'll notice that Takeshita helpfully has sections in bold titles and subsections in italics, so it's very well organized. She begins the conclusion by restating all those same research questions she had in the introduction. And now we'll finally get some answers, I think, in this final section. So let's look at those answers. And her answers come in 3 parts. First, she has now a better understanding of how to read her own IUD body. The thesis of the essay might be to show how IUD developers configured their reproductive technologies to what they thought were the, quote, ideal users as they adapted to the changing social and political environments around the world. In other words, they were thinking about the most profitable audience for the product and not exactly about who would benefit the most. What she learns from anthropologists who have interviewed women all over the world is that it isn't always about a binary situation of the IUD as bad or good. It is usually a more kind of nuanced situation that depends on the circumstances in which that choice is made. And that realization helped Takeshita understand that her own choice isn't exactly free. She had surrendered her own body to a certain set of medical expectations and a certain kind of lifestyle. In our modern language that we have now, we would say that the algorithm had pegged her as a monogamous, safe user who will dutifully report to the doctor for regular checkups. In this sense, she realizes that choices about her body weren't always 100% about real choice, but always mixed with a type of coercion about what these developers perceived as ideal consumers of medical technological products. So second conclusion. Second, she now has a better understanding, even if it's still mixed, about her own complicity in choosing to get an IUD. By taking a feminist technoscience studies approach, she is owning up to her own position of privilege as what she calls the ideal neoliberal user of the IUD. She is in the profitable demographic of the global north, and she can reap all the benefits of a device that was developed and perfected at the expense of many women in the global south. So there was real harm done in the development of this technology, as we'll discuss much more in the next lecture. But here, in the conclusion, Takeshita is more interested in how she can do both things, right? She can continue to benefit from IUD technology and remain committed to her feminist critique of its problematic history. So she understands that this is a contradiction. She understands that this contradiction and complicity can never be perfectly resolved, but it is something that she recommits herself to investigating and to pointing out. Instead of just pretending to be a neutral researcher about IUD history, she commits herself to exposing just how difficult that history is. Third, this is the third conclusion. She concludes by pointing out that it's not all just about contextual use. So just saying that is also not good enough. This would mean that the IUD is just something out there neutrally as an option for women to choose in whatever context they're in. And that's just not the case. The very existence of something like the IUD is about social relations, and it's about global politics. And this essay's, quote, reflexive embodied scholarship has revealed the complicated connections between women in the global north and women in the global south. The development of the technology was not some objective, universal good. It was instead a meticulous calculation that depended on navigating the shifting definitions of ideal consumers of the product.